All right, Johann Kurtz, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. This is our first face-to-face conversation, which obviously always makes things a little bit easier. And I'm really glad to have you here, man.
Definitely, yeah. No more awkward me staring at you, you wondering who the hell you're talking to.
Well, look, as someone who's on the other side of it, who was fully anonymized for a very long time, I 100% get it. But the experience of talking to someone face-to-face, even via a camera, is so much easier than waiting for the sound bar to, go flat. It just makes it much more natural. I can actually look at you and see if you're done talking, if you're waiting to, finish a thought. Point is, this doesn't matter to my audience, but I am glad to be talking to you face to face.
No, it's good for me too. And the funny thing is, I can kind of relax. I was a bit cagey, like, oh, I'm showing my face. What's going to happen? What's the worst that could happen? And that announcement post for the book on Twitter, for whatever reason, I mean, we have some very generous friends with likes and retweets, got 500,000 views almost. And immediately people from my former employer started following me and messaging me. So I was like, oh, okay, well, I'm completely unemployable now. May as well go all the way in on the Jay Burden Show. Nothing to worry about.
Well, I mean, as someone who recently went through that, it was sort of freeing because you're waiting for the hammer to drop and then you realize, oh, wait, there really was no hammer, at least in that way, right? Okay, sure. You might have a few people calling you gay, and instead of doing it the normal way, they, edit a photo of your face, but I kind of expected that. Yeah, it really was. I'm not surprised that it went well, but I'm, glad nonetheless. So you were here not just to talk about your physical appearance, but to talk about a book you have written. You were generous enough to send me a review copy, and I really enjoyed it. I read a lot of books for this channel. A lot of books written by people with online followings to one degree or another. And I don't necessarily review all of them because if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, as the aphorism goes. Your book was very good. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I read it in one sort of madcap sitting, and there were a lot of things that you mentioned there that were sorely needed if we're going to make this project, our project, generational. So if you could, Johann, could you just introduce this book?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the book is, I've got a copy here. Why don't I show it now that my camera's on? The book is called, there we go. Yeah. Called Leaving a Legacy, Inheritance, Charity, and Thousand-Year Families. And the concept is, or at least was, quite simple, which is that increasingly we're seeing various kinds of skepticism from the wealthy older generation about passing on their wealth. This takes various forms. Some of it is an entitlement to spend that wealth down. Some of it is a growing notion that it's more morally right to give your wealth to charity rather than to your children, or that, giving wealth to your children just encourages them to be lazy and robs them of that kind of bootstraps experience that the boomers knew and loved. And I thought that this was a difficult discussion that was worthy of an intervention, a book-length treatment, because there are actually only certain things. There are certain things which can only be accomplished in the context of intergenerational collaboration, dynastic efforts, these great projects. And at the sort of maximalist scale, this is the sort of cathedrals of this world, but at a smaller scale, it's meaningful communities that are built around families. It's families that are flourishing in multiple dimensions of their lives, with, having the opportunity to have children of their own and so forth. And so I wrote this book, which is sort of a philosophical defense of inheritance. And it tackles all of these issues one by one. I thought it would be a simple book. Actually, it turns out that a lot of these concepts are far more either complex or misunderstood than they might appear. So it became necessary to define what is charity, what is philanthropy, what is meritocracy, what is nepotism. Like, we throw these terms around and people base some of the most important decisions in their lives around them, only having the vaguest sense of what they mean when situated correctly, where these terms come from, what they were intended to do. And so the book is anyway, it ties all of this together to try and make a compelling, persuasive, kind, approachable, intuitive argument to an older, non-radicalized Christian sort of boomer patriarch, the value of and a guide to building something dynastic within their own family, either at great wealth or at modest wealth. But basically, I just wanted to make sure that our guys had the tools to defend their own position and to claim what I think is rightfully theirs.
So let's start with charity and philanthropy. This is an example from, my family, not particularly close, but nonetheless, someone in my immediate circle who is, aging, has no children, wealthy, and has said, I'm leaving it all to the animal shelter, to charity. When we're both gone, it all just disperses, will be used for good works. So you pretty thoroughly, I guess, pull apart that idea. But let's start at the top, which quite simply, what's wrong with that line of thinking?
So great question. I think a good provocation to even start this discussion is, what is charity? Or what is philanthropy? You hear these terms, and I've spoken to some in the course of researching this book and since its publication. I've spoken to some people that do control significant wealth. And you would think that these basic building blocks of reasoning were at least clear in their minds. But if you ask them to define charity and philanthropy and what's the difference, they're often at a loss. Like our culture has really neglected nurturing clarity on these issues. But the history is very interesting. So charity and philanthropy is necessary to sort of define these things at a basic level to answer your question, which is, why is it wrong to leave your wealth to a dog shelter? Charity is a Christian virtue. That's at least originally what it was. It doesn't mean giving things to people. Charity comes from the Latin caritas, which comes from the biblical coin Greek agape, which is a sort of higher expression of personal love. And then a sort of more rigorous Christian definition would be something like love for your God, and due to that love for your God, love for your fellow man, who is a reflection of the Creator. He's made in the likeness of his Creator, and following divine law, you should love your brother as well. And so in the sort of Christendom, the tradition that built the West with its beautiful cathedrals and really the entirety of our patrimony, our history, and everything we've accomplished, this is what charity was understood as, this theological virtue that finds a diversity of expressions, whether that is almsgiving, which is giving to the poor, whether that is liberality, which is the notion that when you're confronted with a situation that demands an outlay of wealth to achieve something important, you're willing to just part with the wealth because you understand that wealth is a tool to achieve things in the real world. It's not something to be hoarded in the abstract in a bank account. But also things like fraternal correction, really any form of desiring and acting on what is best for your fellow man. But the important thing is that all of them are grounded in love. And indeed, I would argue, as I do in the book, a sense of personal love that can only really emerge in personal encounters and personal relationships and communities and families and so forth. And, all of these ideas, my ideas, and really our society's ideas about charity more generally, basically spring from a small number of biblical passages, arguably chief amongst them, the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is this very interesting, complex interaction which results in moral obligations to those present at the scene, regardless of their backgrounds. Philanthropy is something different. Philanthropy comes much later, and it's a distinct activity. Philanthropy is something that emerges out of this confluence of events where you have this incredibly wealthy selection of men in the late 19th century, men like Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, big industrial magnates, and the richest men of their day, who, especially in the case of Carnegie, has this very, very tenuous relationship with his faith. He attends church sometimes, can't quite justify it, perhaps as a deist, but is certainly fading and definitely doesn't live his life or conduct his charity according to theological principles. So he basically is one of the main initiators in this very famous text called The Gospel of Wealth, of creating this thing which is called philanthropy, which basically says, like, okay, if I'm not going to follow Christian tradition of charity, which is rooted in particular communities, it's typically palliative, so it finds people who are suffering and finds ways to ease their pain and suffering. So, it clothes the homeless, it feeds the hungry, it gives alms to the poor, it increases the funding at hospitals, local hospitals, hospices, these kind of things. He says, well, if I'm not bound by that entire moral framework, what can I deploy to maximize the use of this tremendous fortune? And he turns sort of to the post-Enlightenment principles, science, the emerging sciences of sociology, psychology, really governance as we now understand it. And he says, and he condemns people that give to those who are close to them, who haven't rigorously analyzed that giving in scientific ways. And he constructs this vision of philanthropy as distinct from charity, which is basically institutional, it's scientific, it's bureaucratic. It attempts to really alter the human condition fundamentally to prevent the things that we would recognize as the consequences of a fallen world from ever occurring. So poverty, etc. To go to the source of these problems. The problem there is that what you're essentially discussing at that point is something that's a bit like governance, it's a bit like politics. It certainly has these kind of appearances and logic of macroeconomics. It's not really charity at all. It demands no personal connection, no love. And indeed, it has all these useful characteristics, like whoever undertakes this activity gets to accrue personal power to them. They get to lead powerful, well-staffed institutions. So this, I think, will be a familiar, you can see where I'm going. Anyway, the fundamental point is this. And in the second chapter, I look at how disastrous some of this is, but perhaps I won't cover whole chapters at a time. The point essentially is this. If you're a Christian and you think that it is morally incumbent on you to give to a quote-unquote charity, so-called, because of your Christian moral obligations, giving to a dog charity after your death does not meaningfully satisfy that. It certainly wouldn't in a patristic sense, according to the Church Fathers. St. Basil says that wealth given after death is not charity because you're not releasing money, you're not sacrificing, you don't know the consequences of that. Death is releasing your riches. You're just sort of like directing them with one last gasp and then releasing them out into the world. So whatever you're doing, it's an entirely new thing. Now, what I argue in the book is, and it might be a bit of a leap to go straight to the end of that conclusion, but I sort of look at this from various angles. When you untether money and you send it off into the world, untethered from a family with a mission that has been inculcated with virtue and a sense of dynastic purpose, the effects of that are very, very negative for society as a whole. But especially, frankly, to just cut to the chase, when you have a civilization which is in the state that ours are now in, right, with our guys struggling to form families, struggling to form relationships, struggling to buy land that allows them to get on the property ladder, dying deaths of despair. There simply are people in all of our lives whose lives could be improved immeasurably, like the basic facets of their dignity, by the right intervention, by someone who is prepared to go to them, to deeply understand their problem, to love them, right? So to enact this charity and to invest in them to improve that situation. Like I think that our civilization very clearly needs that right now. So these like confused, self-indulgent, moral last stands by people that are not willing to embed themselves in the lives of the needy, whether these are the local poor or family members or anyone else, and grapple with the complexity there. I just don't think that's a morally just or defensible act.
Several things there. One, it reminds me very much of the kind of early moral problem you hear repeated in the Church Fathers, which is the idea of, should you sell your children into slavery to feed the poor? And the counter to that is obviously no, you should not. You are giving something that is not yours away, right? You were selling someone else short, I guess, literally in this case. So violating your primary obligations, those close around you, for the benefit of sort of aggregate humanity. It's this sort of Benthamite idea of kind of maximizing utils, maximizing the scientifically derived amount of human flourishing. I'm using that term somewhat ironically, right? Kind of poking fun at Harris. But nonetheless, it is sort of an interesting deferral of responsibility. And that's a point that you make, that you are effectively accruing the benefits of charity without the hard work or the responsibility, while also, as you've said, leaving a certain moral obligation. I think that the example you go into, examining the Ford Foundation, which is something that will be familiar to, I hope, all my listeners, is sort of a primary example of that. Of one, this ostensibly very successful version of philanthropy, one of the richest men in the world, creating this sort of eternal pot of money to do good. And not only does he and his progeny lose control of it, which is very important, right? It sort of becomes part of the managerial regime and used for ends directly opposed to those for which it was set up. But also, looking at it that way, even if that sort of posthumous donation, even if that hands-off charity is maximally successful, if you were able to start your own foundation, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that even if you were able to do that, it does not accomplish the sort of good you would want it to. You ultimately lose the authority over it, and someone else will be making those decisions. And particularly if you are religious, if you are in some ways a dissident, you must understand that the managers selected on the open market will not share your values. They will take that elsewhere. We see that already in charities, right? The meme of Catholic charities in the US, which are ostensibly Catholic organizations headed up by people who do not seem to be Catholic, based on either their heritage or their actions. And you can see that what may have been started with noble intentions has been perverted to completely different ends. You mention, you actually quote from Calvin, right, to support this. But there's a piece, your own writing, I would have quoted because I thought it was quite well stated. We cannot truly love who we do not know, who we do not see, and who we do not understand. Can you explore the relationship between knowing and sort of performing charity? Right? Why does that kind of heat map meme matter with regards to charity? I know you've mentioned that for many of us, there are people immediately in our lives who need charity, but wouldn't the counter argument be, well, what does it matter if it's this drug addict I know or some drug addict somewhere in the world? Clearly, I can just give my money and accomplish the same net amount of good.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two ways to approach this. One is a practical sense, and then another is a sort of more metaphysical sense. I'll start with the metaphysical sense because I think probably people will intuitively understand what I'm trying to communicate, and then I can move to the practical. In the metaphysical sense, the problem with what's called telescopic charity, which is this notion that, you're called to love every man in the world, but no man in particular, right? Just identify the, however far off, however distant, some kind of mathematical abstraction of the most efficient use of your money, your charitable dollars. The problem is that very, very often, I think subconsciously, that is chosen as a trade-off is made, which in my mind is an unacceptable one. The trade-off is this. On the one hand, I concede that I will not personally understand what my money is doing very well. For example, even if I'm given something like the best effective altruist case, it's buying mosquito nets at the most efficient price to be deployed in Kenya, which is like mathematically proven to save the most number of lives. I still understand nothing about the community that those nets are going into. I don't know what's going to happen to those children. I don't know why that community can't produce something as inexpensive as mosquito nets. I don't know ultimately whether this will lead to a virtuous outcome because I don't know anything about the trajectory of that society. Like, am I accelerating a trend in which more and more mouths to feed are being born every year due to this like ill-informed money pumping into the system? Is there corruption in the area? Like the list goes on. Basically, because I've never been there, because I understand nothing about the society, the cause of the problems, the long-term solutions, how multi-layered those solutions have to be, who are good actors, who are bad actors, how we came to be at this place. I understand nothing about it. So the trade-off is something like, I concede that I'm not going to understand any of this. On the other hand, what I gain is ease. It's just a bank transfer, right? I can go on whatever effective altruist listing website. To
sort of steelman the position, you could also make the argument for economies of scale. It is simply more efficient. division of labor. Simply, it is more efficient to have, someone whose whole job is charity than to have me be or act as a part-time philanthropist. Sorry.
But the counterpoint to that argument of scale is institutions which are supposed to change people's lives for the better, as they scale up, as they become more bureaucratized and abstract and separated from particular or lived communities, become more and more crude instruments for improving people's lives. The Gates Foundation, for example, throws around a huge amount of money in lots of different domains. But if you actually dig into the actual effects in those domains, even more on the surface, it would appear to someone like you or me to be like a defensible line of effort. It's pretty questionable how well it's doing compared to local charities on the ground, local government, the natural trend of scientific development, and so forth. And then if you look at somewhere like New York, there's this crazy statistic that north of 20% of private workers in New York are now employed by nonprofits, but it's just like transparently not making New York a better place, because it's just like money and organizations, bureaucracies, different legal entities thrashing around a system without any kind of personal moral structure or obligations. So that's the kind of like argument against telescopic charity. It's like, well, that's the argument for telescopic charity. It's convenient, although you acknowledge that you're making something of a trade-off. The problem is that like people delude themselves as to the nature of the trade-off they're making. What they're actually doing is they're avoiding the difficult, tedious, sometimes risky, often painful, often quite boring act of like meeting the people who are struggling in your own life and community, in your family, and going through the deep like process of understanding them deeply. How can I actually help you? And that's uncomfortable. Like that's a huge investment that transcends, a bank transfer to Oxfam or whatever. And people just use the excuse of these people in Africa are like objectively more needy as a kind of like consolation for themselves, and they're like so conscious that gnaws at them that they're not really being nice people to the people who really depend on them, the people who they have a unique bond, and I would argue metaphysical responsibility to. But it's really only that latter form, these like deep investments and bonds of understanding, that can really produce transformative change. And I think that's true both in the charitable sector. There's a very good book called Toxic Charity by this veteran charity industry leader, Robert Lupton, who looks at all these different projects and basically says like a lot of these charities have been coasting for decades based on the presumption that they must be doing good because they have a noble mission and a lot of funding, and they like are active in areas with a lot of need in them. But if you actually look at their effects, they basically just generate massive dependencies on structures that act as like handout institutions. They just create a whole class of dependence and prevent anyone from engaging in like transformative change or industry within the communities. On the other hand, like if you think about how really transformative effects on society or families are actually achieved, it's a sustained multilateral effort that leverages relationships, love, care, resources, but also like, it's people facilitating introductions, it's people checking in on people, even as something as like abstract as venture capital, which is the thing I talk about in the book. Like top VC firms are incredibly involved, in getting their team on the boards of companies, making sure that their companies are receiving the right advice, guidance, connections, facilitations, as well as funding. It's not just like here's a check, I never want to hear from you again. I know you're going to go off and do good things with it, goodbye. That's just not how the world of actual effects work. So there's this whole fake industry which has grown up around accepting people's checks to make them feel good. And its effects on the world are like at best deeply questionable. And in the case of something like the Ford Foundation, it's just complete chaos.
But one of the other, shall we say, oft repeated ideas is the fact that, even if it's not directly towards charity, it's the idea that I will spend down my wealth before I die, that I will die with nothing. You mentioned Bill Perkins' book, Die with Zero. And in this section of the book, you surmise the three basic claims. So I'll quote you from your own writing, and then I'll let you respond to that. Claim 1, one's hard-earned wealth is your own to spend. 2, the pursuit of pleasure is a legitimate way to spend it. And 3, this is an entirely reasonable way to spend your older years. So given those three claims, what is your response? Why should you not simply spend all your wealth down and let your children claw their way up the way you did?
It's a good question. Forgive me for answering the first point theologically, but I think even if you're not Christian, like, you'll follow the moral logic and be able to transpose it onto whatever your own system of belief is. This notion that what we have earned is ours is one that has to be approached seriously, but also carefully from a Christian perspective. On the one hand, there is a very strong theology and tradition of private property in Christianity. One of the reasons the Catholic Church came out incredibly strongly against communism, if you read an encyclical like Rerum Novarum, it becomes obvious why that is. On the other hand, there is a tendency in the opposite direction, which is very much a sort of recent post-Enlightenment secular Western idea, which is this notion of, it's a kind of maximalist notion of private property, which says something like, that which I own, I alone own, and there are no natural duties which attach to that property or my stewardship, my ownership of it. So it's something like, property means that which I control and that with which I can do whatever I want. And there's sort of no moral obligation inherent to the fact that I've become wealthy or powerful through control of this asset. That would be an alien concept to basically the Christians of high Christendom. There's something that is now sort of called the dominion mandate, which I think is a reasonable term. It's this notion that, to sort of cut further back in time than our sort of post-John Locke conception of, and it might even be like a parody almost that we've inherited of John Locke's more subtle thought. But before that, if you go back to like, what is property? There's this very intimate relationship between an asset and stewardship of it. And that really is built of the recognition that everything we have, it is true that we have mixed our labor with the wonderful natural resources of the world and have created something that we can rightfully call ours. But at the same time, it has to be recognized that even our labor and the world of natural resources are in some sense a gift. Existence itself is a gift, right? So did we create our particular talents? Did we create our geniuses? Did we create the men who we have to collaborate with to be productive, the men we learn from, our fathers? Did we create the systems that we were brought into? And the world, I mean, the world itself, there's a wonderful passage from Montaigne, did we create, the horror moving vaults of the heavens and so forth? It's the point is that we have to approach like great wealth with a perspective of stewardship rather than sort of flippancy. Like, it's a position of humility that even the wealthy and powerful must have to the world. And there's a very good sort of Christian tradition there, and I think there's a lot of interesting argumentation to pull from. So that's the kind of starting point, which is that, like, yes, you are the rightful steward of these assets. The key word there being steward. Like, this is something that you must nurture and nourish as part of the gratitude for the privilege of living this life of wealth and power. The second point is, what was it, like pleasure? Is it, remind me of my own writing here?
The pursuit of pleasure is a legitimate way to spend your wealth.
Yeah. So what I look at in the book is, again, there's a kind of reasonable position and a maximalist position, which I think is distorted. The reasonable position would be something like, part of glorifying God and enjoying the gifts He has given us is enjoying life, is appreciating beautiful things, is building beautiful things, commissioning beautiful things, treating people to beautiful things. It's a life of appreciation. It's a life of richness. It's a life of beauty. This is all true. On the other hand, the nihilist extreme version of this is something like hedonism, whereby one's entire life and life plans are sort of oriented to this kind of question of, how do I derive maximal pleasure from rearranging reality around me? The problem there, and I look at the work of Robert Nozick, who's an influential 20th century philosopher, on hedonism, and makes this compelling case, which again is it's a secular argument, but I think it aligns fine with the Christian tradition. The question of why, Nozick gives this example of an experience machine, which is like, you can create any experience you want. It can be the most pleasurable thing to you. And like, frankly, like, I think in the age of the computer, we can all kind of, the experience machine has really come to life. Why is that wrong? If that's giving you pleasure, if you're enjoying it? And the answer is something like, yes, there is moral import attached to the world of experience, and pleasure, even aesthetics. But equally, there is moral import attached to the world of being. And this question of, what are you? You know, what have you become? And any moral system in which someone that is just despicable, that is ugly, disgusting, corrupted, fetid, can participate as fully as a sort of stalwart, good man, is one that is clearly morally bankrupt. And so the problem with adopting this fully hedonist position is that it's sort of like, it implicates you, your being. What are you? Do you really want to spend your final years on this earth in this act of like cheap, lukewarm hedonism on P&O cruises or whatever? It's just like, this is your chance at existence. I really like that section. There's a quote from St. Alphonsus Liguori that chapter ends with. And he says something like, in the heavens there will be no tears, but if the blessed could weep, they would only do so because they now have no more time to achieve glory on this earth. Which is like, this is it. This is how you define your legacy. This is what you define you will be for eternity. You're just wasting it. So really, it's the synthesis of those two things, which is, I think, is an inspiring reality, which is that, no, your duty to those you love, your community, your posterity, your generations, your legacy, and your forefathers, for that matter, does not end when you legally retire and start collecting pension checks. Like, those are two entirely different systems. Your command to dominate the world, in the best sense, in the sort of kingly sense, continues, and it will continue. That's a Christian virtue that will continue until the end of your days, until you draw your last breath. And that means you still have duty, purpose. You have to be involved deeply in the lives of those who depend on you, and be asking very deeply, how can you place a marker in the ground which will sort of stretch forth throughout the history that follows? So, you know, there's nothing, there are redeemable qualities to Bill Perkins' book. It's a sort of useful illustration of what I'm talking about. I like that he challenges people who are very flippant about their money to like confront, okay, this is how long I have left on this earth, and this is how much I have in my control. How am I going to use it? I think that's a useful challenge. I think, unfortunately, Bill Perkins does not have the metaphysical or theological framework and depth necessary to answer that question properly.
So one more hypothetical, and then I really want to spend the majority of what time we have left talking about the mechanics of how to do this, because I think this is, if I could be so bold, I think this is the best part of your book. But one more that's worth talking about is the oft-repeated idea that, well, if I pass my wealth on to my family, I will create layabouts, useless, adult children who have, access to too much money, and they will squander it all. Or alternately, in the case of a business, if I pass my business to my, my son or my nephew, I would be better served by finding a manager, right? Finding someone who has a degree, who's better trained to do that. Surely a family business in that sense must be less efficient. So if you could address those kind of two common critiques there.
Yeah, they're both quite complex questions. I'll answer the second one first. This is a really complex area. Like, why there are people who have very legitimate objections to their ability to pass on their wealth to their children. There's actually a whole industry of professional succession planning. In my estimation, to oversimplify a complex issue, a lot of this has to do with starting the process far too late, because people regard a career as just like, it's a career. Like, I'll just offer him a good job when I'm about to retire, and I'm sure he'll take it. But actually, a career is an expression of one's purpose in life. It's an expression of one's identity. It implicates where you want to live, who you want to socialize with, which status networks you want to be a part of, what you want to project out into the world, what you want your legacy to be. And that has to be aligned. There has to be some facilitation of identity integration from a very young age in life. Aristocratic families who obviously have to achieve this successfully generation after generation, they're all in the same family business, which is power, rule. for hundreds or thousands of years. The ones who have done this successfully understand that this has to start at birth. And if you start too late, you're inevitably going to be playing catch up. You might be able to save it, but it's going to be very difficult. And the like common paradigm is there's like a one common failure mode is this person needs to learn to stand on their own 2 feet before they come and work for the family business. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send them off to a generic college on the other side of the country. I'm then going to encourage them to like start work in a field where they got to prove themselves. They got to learn how life is with no leg ups. They got to work a few layers up. Maybe they got to meet and impress a woman. And then, when they've proven themselves, when they know the value of hard work, they can come in and work for the family business. If they're even interested in doing that after they've charted out an entirely separate life path, they will then come back into their industry, be surrounded by people who've been working in that industry for 10 plus years already, know everything about it, know more than them. They will feel what is called commonly imposter syndrome, although in this case is largely just being an imposter. You actually just don't know as much as all these people you're now supposed to be leading. And they'll retreat in embarrassment, and that the thing falls apart. And you hear that time and time again. Done correctly, though, it absolutely doesn't have to be this way. So an interesting finding, well established, by the way, in the business literature, is that family firms, certainly top family firms, outcompete and outperform publicly traded firms. And the reasons for this are multifaceted, but it has to do with family firms being uniquely positioned to overcome the perpetual ultra short-term planning that besets publicly traded companies pursuing specific quarters with a rotating cast of, sort of mercenary managers who like have to hit specific KPIs on a specific schedule. The incentives work much better for family businesses. They can think on ultra long time horizons. They can start succession planning very early. They have a natural loyalty to the company. They have assets other than purely financial and mercenary ones and so forth. So there's an established and very good literature on this front. Professor John A. Davis, formerly of Harvard Business School and MIT Sloan School of Management, is the place to start for that, although it's widely discussed. Remind me what your first question was. Sorry.
Oh, well, I can't remember, so it must not have been important. What I want to move on to next, because I think, like I said, this is perhaps, in my mind, the most important part, is, well, how do you build a dynastic family? And assuming that you are, and look, I don't have a lot of insight into my podcast demographics, but I have at least rough age estimates. Assuming you are a guy starting out, right? You've got young children. You're looking to kind of copy this model in your own life. Like, what are the first steps? What should you prioritize? What are the things that enable a family to create a culture that can be passed down through time?
It's a great question. So the first thing to say is that the book is written from the perspective of wealthy and aristocratic families. There's a few reasons for this, but I would argue that a happy finding is that most of these are practicable at a more modest level for families that are not ultra wealthy, which is a happy finding for me because I am not ultra wealthy. Although I did grow up, it's not entirely internet based. I grew up around some wealthy families, so I do have some personal experience of life in these communities. The first thing is like, there's this concept that I talk about in the book, which I like very much. It's sort of my personal favorite aspect of the book, which is this concept of kind of eternal time, that the individual family member is situated within a community of those who went before, and those who will come after, in a very intense and lived way. Alexis de Tocqueville has this wonderful passage about the importance of a landed family estate passing from generation to generation. And he says, all generations are, as it were, contemporaneous. It's this notion that you actually grow up in the felt presence of your forefathers. And as such, you feel their moral expectations to be incumbent upon you. You feel that your family name, in its very essence, bears a sense of moral expectation. But more than that, you feel empowered by the sense that their blood runs in your veins and you're capable of what they achieved. So there are a lot of things you can do to move your family from the kind of contingent moment into this into a more felt sense of this eternal time. The thing that a lot of aristocratic families do, but is difficult in the contemporary age, certainly in America, is this multi-generational property where quite literally you are building on the same foundation as your forefathers built. And that brings other advantages too, because you're inheriting the estate, which is something that is theoretically very valuable, but it brings these intense obligations of stewardship in a very direct way, rather than being kind of liquid capital that's easy to squander. So it sort of trains you and demands of you as the heir to pursue the best things in life, the most beautiful things, community building, estate management, patronizing artwork, sustaining the entire economy of individuals that revolve around that family and community. But more modestly, it's this whole sense of like participation in rituals, certainly in a religious life. One of the funny things that, I guess it's December, so I can speak fairly unashamedly about Christmas. But there's this funny thing about Christmas, which is kind of everyone returns to the faith just a little bit on Christmas. You know, everyone wants to go to mass for Christmas. Things aren't quite felt proper. Things don't have their phenomenological richness in them if Jesus isn't present, if there isn't, you know, if you don't hear the carols being sung, and there's something about the ritual of Christmas that is a good illustration of the broader principle that I talk about in the book, which is the kind of ritualized family, the ritual protected family, which is, I like that quote from Johann, the Korean-German philosopher, who says that while houses are homes in space, rituals are homes in time. They're this thing that we can return to and find identity and consolation in, that are deeply affirming of a particular continued identity, a sort of historical continuity. But in Christmas, I think it's in large part because Christmas is such a ritualized day that the practices of 500 years ago are still totally legible to us on that day. We still act out the same functions. We still believe the same things. Maybe there have been subtle changes, but the music is similar. You still go to the same churches, midnight mass, and the same sets of foods and so forth. These things, of course, gradually evolve, but especially with this kind of eternal religious component, it's the same themes. The sermons are on the same moral dimensions. And that ritual dimension, which ties together moral assertion, tradition, belief, action, and then expectation, all in a single day, there's no reason why that principle should extend only to Christmas, right? So actually, it turns out, if you look at the literature, the families who best pass on the faith throughout the year lead these incredibly ritualized existences, which sort of ties the faith. And here, if you're not a Christian, you can substitute in the values that you hold dear, the kind of children that you want to raise. They substitute in those beliefs at every element. They tie them into rituals all through the calendar in a way that evokes a sense of warmth and comfort and familial solidarity, even nostalgia for a warm childhood full of fun. The classic Christian expression of this is the liturgical calendar, and then the calendar of like kind of fun and festive events, which was sort of parallel to the liturgical calendar. So like all year round, you had different festivals. What we think of now as Christmas is kind of like the last pillar still standing of an ancient ruin, which was once majestic in its glory, full of pageantry and strange myths and expressions of belief and identity and community. And there's many reasons why that's gone. But the kind of 1,000-year family, the great aristocratic families, are highly ritualized to this day. And if you look at the British royal family, and there's a lot of issues with the British royal family, but people are familiar with them, so I'll use them for the ease of convenience. They have this very specific calendar that comes with obligations that the children are involved with from very young, Maundy Thursday traditions and so forth. That I think is this kind of wellspring of perpetual identity and actually strengthens through time as opposed to becomes dissipated through time.
Yeah, so you use this term uh, ritual protected families, which I think is quite interesting. Uh, you, in sort of the last third, uh, you describe effectively four common themes throughout generationally successful families. One of the things you get into is that you can actually track the success of these sort of families in highly diverse circumstances. So it stands to reason that in the feudal system, such families would do well. But those same names, even into the 21st century, continue to overperform. So these 4 points are: never forget the normal practices and rituals of raising healthy children. Ensure that your family has a strong faith and knows duties as well as privileges. Impress upon your children your family's identity, mission, and values, and initiate children into structures beyond the atomic family. So, two things I want to bring up there, because several of them are, I would consider them to be widely accepted among conservative circles writ large. But there are two that are, I think, would raise hackles, which is one, the idea of noting duties as well as privileges, and then also initiating children into structures beyond the atomic family. Do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, let me take the initiation one first, but let me remember your first question this time, which was the duties as well. So man has this deep psychological need to know who he is, to subsume his identity into wider and established structures as a source of self-reification, and to be accepted by his community of peers as that thing that he strives to be. The simplest example of this is like, if you think about a soldier, especially in the US context, where soldiers are very revered, it's considered a privilege to wear the uniform, to graduate. At that point, people will recognize you as a serviceman of a particular branch, and you will become, as it were, a contemporary of all the great men who wore that uniform before you. You will share in their identity. You will find a foundation of the self there. You will be respected as such by others. And that's a kind of heightened example of something that we all need. Like, initiation in its most abstract form is a human universal. There are life stages that we expect people to go through, and then we recognize that they have been tested and that they have passed the test, and that they have therefore been assumed into a particular body within society. In the pre-modern West, this was very universal. So you didn't just have the kind of last one standing now is university. Like, graduates are epistemically distinct from non-graduates. Like, we think of graduates and non-graduates as two different things. Like, did you go to college? Where did you go to college? You know, are you a Yale man? Whatever. You know, it's this kind of like series of tests which results in something given to you. You are now recognized as something else, which affords you status in society. And that's not just practically useful, it's like psychologically important. Like, some people I've met who didn't go to university but wish they did kind of have a complex about it. And I'm not saying at all you should have a complex about it, or that's right. But like, in their particular example, they clearly felt that process of initiation, that particular expression of initiation, was an important one, that they never got the chance to prove themselves to be something that they felt they were. But in older times, you know, in the West, you had guilds, you had you had families, chivalric orders, monastic orders. I mean, like, there's a very diverse expression of a tradesman in a particular domain recognizes himself in a particular way and wants to be recognized as that by a community of his peers, as someone who has a dignified calling in life and who has taken on a difficult profession and risen to it. And then if you go back further, you know, if you look at the work of Arnold van Gennep and Mircea Eliade and so forth, they kind of find that this is a universal amongst pre-modern human communities, especially for young boys. Boys need to go through this transition where, when they're very young, they sort of like, you know, they cling to their mothers. they fall under their mother's protection, and that's useful for them to like physically mature in a dangerous world, to have that sense of comfort. But to be recognized as a man in all pre-modern societies, there has to be a decisive moment where the boy is separated from the mother. He is presented with a test, which he must perform in front of the community. The community must recognize that he passed the test, and therefore he is recognized as a man, depending on the configuration, as a warrior or whatever else. And he is therefore accorded a certain respect and identity in society, which bonds beautifully with his own identity, his individuation, but it's this process of integration with a community, those who went before him, those that will come after. That is a very long way of explaining initiation, and I apologize for it. But the point is this. We've really gone through a process of weakening in this regard, and which I regard as like a major psychological challenge to the men of the West, psychological and spiritual challenge. They don't have any sense of who they are, what uniform they're supposed to be wearing, which men they are, which men of history they are supposed to be the equals of, whose standards they're supposed to live up to, what it means to express those standards, which stories from history are most relevant to their own struggles. Like, they're just totally untethered because they've never had any of this. One of the things I note is that aristocratic families, and they by no means do this perfectly to this day, but there are certain families that do it well, they have initiatory bodies which continue deep into adult life that have privilege and status accorded to them. These can be knightly orders, Order of the Golden Fleece, Order of the Garter in the UK. But they can also be fraternal societies. They can be private members clubs. There are all these different kinds of association, various titles that make demands of the moral character of the individual, and then recognize them and initiate them into a privileged network should they be completed. And at that point, they can sort of represent themselves. And this doesn't really live on strongly to this day, but still in London, you still get a bit of the old like boys club. Oh, I belong to this club. I belong to that club. Like, there's a sense of solidarity with other people in the same situation as you, which I think is very useful. So in so doing, you initiate yourself again into this community of peers with moral expectations which are incumbent upon you. And that is very necessary, along with faith and so forth, to feel that your privilege comes with this sense of duty. And if you fail in that duty, there are real penalties.
We're fast coming up on time, Johann, but I feel like it's worth discussing. This is a through line through almost everything you've mentioned. What about the dangers of nepotism? Surely we don't want to, again, have anyone other than the perfect person for any given role as chosen by a sort of vaguely defined meritocracy. What is your I guess rebuttal to objections based off of nepotism?
Yeah, something very weird is happening with this concept of nepotism. I'll look at the history of the term in a second, but just like to start with a very basic observation, if you look at the textbook nepo baby quote unquote controversy industry at the moment, it's acting, right? But acting has always been a family business. There are generations of families who act and who hire within the family, who initiate themselves into the industry, and the same is true in music. I wish I could remember who it was. I was listening to an interesting discussion the other day. It might have even been on your show. Tell me if it was, but it was about Bach and how Bach came from an extended and broad family of musicians, of even genius musicians. And there appeared to be even some kind of level of selective breeding going on there, which inevitably resulted in a genius. But the point is that family business is completely normal within Western history, are obviously going to arise. It doesn't make sense. It is completely illogical to assume that someone who has spent a life accruing experience and knowledge and mastery and relationships within an industry makes no attempt to pass that on to their children and just expects their children to go and work at a law firm or whatever. That's insane. So the West has always operated in this way. Instead, I think what is pathological about nepo babies is the level of celebrity and societal leadership that the actor class now has. That's the real problem. And then so it's there's such wealth and status and riches and everything else that accrues to these people who might be very talented actors, but are clearly unworthy of wielding that level of societal influence and being the stars of society That's a much more complex issue. But nepotism can be very productive. Like the best athletes of all time, most come from like families where their fathers were professional coaches or players. Like Williams sisters, Tiger Woods. Basically you name it. Floyd Mayweather, a bunch of people in football, Max Verstappen in Formula One. Like it's just like growing up around geniuses within a particular domain and being introduced to that domain at a very young age because the genius is already like invested in it. It's just a recipe for creating genius. So the idea that nepotism is like has this antithetical effect on quality is tenuous. I mean, there are examples of it becoming pathological where people that clearly deserve to be in an industry are shut out because they're not part of like a clan. But there are compromises which allow for the best of both worlds, and the West has a long history in that regard. But to very quickly examine the term itself, because I think it's clarifying. Nepotism, as we now understand it, sort of gained its meaning in the West from this book. It's Gregorio Letti's work in the 17th century, Il nepotismo di Roma, and it's a history of the Pope's nephews. Pope's nephews were a particular role within a papal court, which stretches back a very long way, totally unquestioned at the time, probably a little bit odd by now, but it survived for millennia. The notion was simply that the Pope had a right to bring someone into the papal court that was a blood relative. But since popes did not have children of their own, they typically brought in a nephew. Now, this was for two reasons. The first is that like family businesses of all kinds were the norm in the ancient and medieval world. There's this concept of pietas, which is like special moral obligations to your family, which extend outwards from the divine commandment in the Decalogue to especially honor your father and mother. So you have a particular obligation to your own, and indeed in the context of the papal court, with its intrigue, its diverse responsibilities and so forth, it's very useful to have an associate of unquestioned personal loyalty to help you in your most sort of trying enterprises. Nepotism refers to a single period of corruption of that specific office in which, in the context of a broader moral decline of the papacy, there were a series of popes with illegitimate children and other relatives who were brought in under the pretext, under this title of the Pope's nephew, who basically just ransacked the church. And so there was this whole, and this lasted for like 100 years, there was this whole like broad breakdown of the function of the office that resulted in something that everyone everywhere would recognize as sinful and wrong, which was like corruption, looting, lying, etc. All of that is what the original conception of nepotism was. It's like gaining entry to a public institution which is meant for a particular purpose, ransacking that institution from the inside while lying to people, extracting that as personal family wealth. And it's like the same. You see this in politics. Like this has contemporary parallels, but what it doesn't mean is just like, I've spent my whole life working in an industry I love. I want to help my children get into it. That is simply not the same thing. Like the moral dimensions of that are completely different. And unlike ransacking the church, that like obviously has strong societal benefits, personal benefits. It allows a family to continue in the same tradition, maintain family businesses, maintain intergenerational relationships between networks of families, to live in the same place, to pass on rich knowledge to each other that would otherwise die, this kind of embodied knowledge, to feel a sense of affinity between generations, and indeed to produce mastery in the examples of the sports and family businesses, which we gave earlier. So feeling that you shouldn't like specially help out your children because nepotism is bad is just one of the most confused aspects of our contemporary moral discourse, in my mind.
I think that was well answered. Johann, we were unfortunately nearing the end of our time, but I just want to say this book is very good. We didn't touch on a tenth of it, double negative, but there's much more material here. I highly recommend it, both because Johann is a friend and I think he should be supported, but also because it's a very good book. It addresses common problems for both younger and older men. Right? What is the purpose of, what I have collected over the course of my life? How ought I to act as a patriarch? But also for those kind of aspiring patriarchs, how ought I to raise my children? How ought I to direct them through life? And, as someone who's at the very early stages of that, it was very interesting. I got a lot from it. I in addition to, I think I told you I made my best friend buy a copy of it, and I've sent a few to people around me. I like it enough to recommend it to people who don't care about my podcast. So thorough endorsement there. Be a link down in the description. Johann, again, thank you so much for your time, man. This was a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. Thank you for having me. And I expect to see you wearing a suit next time. By the way, this is a poor showing.
Fair enough. I will. Obviously, I will link to your book as well as your Substack, which I highly recommend as well. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. If you want to support this show, you can throw me a few bucks on Patreon, Gumroad, or Substack. Get the episodes early and ad-free, or check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, Johann, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head off. Good night.